If you're a lineman in charge of keeping the lights on, Grainger understands that you go to great lengths and sometimes heights to ensure the power is always flowing, which is why you can count on Grainger for professional-grade products and next-day delivery, so you have everything you need to get the job done. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, and Campus Killings. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking. Hey everyone, welcome back to a new episode of Zodiac Speaking. I'm one of your hosts, Mike Morford, and today we are going to have a very pro-Mac, my favorite suspects, discussion. And, you know, for the naysayers, for the Mac haters, you probably won't like this episode because it's going to be full of Mac positive stuff. And I figured since it was going to be that kind of episode, I wanted to bring on somebody who was very helpful and instrumental in finding a lot of stuff. You know, what I had found originally is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's been a lot of interesting stuff that has been dug up since then, a lot of connections that have been made, and a lot of that's been with the help of people on Tom Voigt's forum, ZodiacKiller.com. And one of those people I wanted to have on in particular was Andrew, who is a guest here today. So Andrew, thank you for coming on. And if you will, just introduce yourself to listeners and, you know, let them know how you became interested in this case and eventually interested in Mac.
Thanks, Buff. So yeah, I'm Andrew on Tom Voigt's board, and I kind of have a background in like academic research, like sociology and so forth. And I guess I got interested, like many people, when the Fincher film came out. I think that was 2007. I kind of became interested in Zodiac around then and discovered lots of the early forums and spent a long time reading about different suspects around that time. And I think that I kind of never really settled on a suspect, but was kind of interested in why people thought Arthur Lee Allen was considered the main suspect. And for a long time, I guess I was like figured that the police or might know something about him as a suspect that the public didn't, and that's perhaps why so many people were figured he was the chief person of interest. But more recently, during the pandemic, obviously I had a lot of downtime, and I started reading. I started updating what I knew about the case, and I was looking on your forum, which was still going at the time, and I returned to places like Tom's forum as well to update what I knew about the case. And it was it became more clear as well, returning to the Graysmith book, that Arthur Lee Allen didn't really fit, you know, many of the descriptions and so forth, and that whilst it's the Yellow Book is an entertaining book, I consider it to be a well-written book. It's quite when you revisit it after looking at other suspects and looking at the witness descriptions, that Graysmith is somewhat stretching his the descriptions to fit his suspect. And I guess it was during the pandemic that I happened to see you had an original thread on Mac who wasn't named at the time. And when I first saw Mac, I actually thought the photograph that you had of him looked like the two sketches, the Berryessa sketch and the Presidio Heights sketch. Although we could talk about perhaps the Berryessa sketch later, because I think now you consider it perhaps not perhaps the sunbathers didn't actually see Zodiac, and there's kind of questions around that. And from there, I was at that point, I kind of like admired the fact that you'd seemingly had a method to attack the problem of who Zodiac was, like afresh. And I began like I'd already seen like a Richard Grinnell had an article on his website about um, Zodiac perhaps being on foot and within inch earshot of the payphone when the operator rang back after the Blue Rock Springs attack. And that Zodiac had written in one of the letters he was surprised, and it was quite clear that Zodiac is perhaps lying about there being an eyewitness to him and his car at that point. And it seems quite a transparent lie, or a kind of somewhat childish lie in some ways. And that kind of got me more interested in Mac as a suspect, because I think you early on you said that there weren't many people living in that area, and Mac's family had this unusual like dual purpose home and business very close to that payphone. And I guess that's how I got first interested in Mac. And with the help of others online, I started looking at the genealogy. And when more articles became available on newspapers recently, we found a lot more information about Mac before 1968.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good intro into how you came on, the scene as far as Mac. And if you're like me, the more things you found, the more interesting he became, and hard to dismiss a lot of that stuff. Just for a backstory for listeners who aren't overly familiar with Mac, I don't want to go too far off into the weeds, but I had found him because I had spent so much time looking for suspects down in Riverside and trying to connect people from Riverside to Vallejo and trying to cross-reference who had lived there. And I found a few people, but none that I thought were Zodiac. And then, I talked to an investigator who gave me some advice, and he says, just focus on the crimes that you know for sure are Zodiacs. And then later on, if you find somebody that you think is Zodiac, see if they happen to be from Riverside, but focus on the crime. So that's what I did. I went back to the drawing board and said, okay, the one thing that really bothered me, and I never could explain this, was that July 4th attack on Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau. Zodiac calls 40 minutes later after the shooting from a phone booth that should have taken like no more than 10 minutes to drive to. So I always said, why is if he could have gotten away, he could have been halfway to San Francisco by then. Why is he still hanging out there, risking being seen, risking someone seeing his car? And then, it dawned on me, what if he lived around there and, had gone home, parked his car, changed his clothes, hid his guns, just anything that would tie him to the crime, just hid it all, and then decided he wanted to mess with the police and to go over to that phone booth to call and taunt the police. And when I did research, I looked at every home, every residence within probably a block of that phone booth. And I was able to find just about everybody that lived in those homes and their family members, and just sort of looked who was there. And I was able to rule some people out based on they were way too old. Maybe I could, they were, not the right race. Maybe they were, some other reason that I was able to rule them out. But, the one thing I learned early on was that close to that phone booth, there was not many people that actually lived in homes near that. So that was the first interesting thing I found about Mac. And, when I started diagnosing, well, he's really trying to sell this idea that somebody saw him talking on the phone booth. He's trying to oversell that, in my opinion. And then if he walked away and started walking back toward his house, he would have heard that phone ring. So I started thinking about that, and I said, this is the only guy I can place like within walking distance easily of that phone booth. It's within eyesight of the phone booth because you could see from his front door down to that corner gas station. So Zodiac seems like somebody that would like to mess with the police and then get his jollies watching the police, ambling around, looking around for clues, and he'd probably be excited by that. So, the proximity was good. It wasn't until I finally found that first picture of Mac that he had the crew cut and glasses as a 1963 phone booth, or excuse me, 1963 yearbook photo. And I said, well, he looks generally like the sketch, but I've seen 1,000 guys that look like the sketch. So I wasn't too excited by that. I said, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send out for some handwriting. And when the handwriting comes back, I'll know, hopefully it doesn't look anything like Zodiac's. And then, you know, I could move on or put him on the back burner. And then once I got that handwriting back, I was like, whoa, this writing looks a lot like Zodiac's. And it had the same slant and everything. And I said, now I've got to go a little bit further and check him out. And then, there were a couple people that helped me early on, sort of behind the scenes before Mac's name was even out there. One was Dave Aranchak, and there were a couple other people, but Dave was really good about sort of laying out Mac's online presence, which wasn't extensive, but he found the website that his wife and he shared, um, and that was on that site where she left that infamous post about finding Mac's code cipher book in his belongings in the guilt box. And she had mentioned that he liked it so much that was his second copy. So right away I'm like, wait a minute, now we've got a guy that likes ciphers, that's living 287 feet from that phone booth, that looks like the sketch. And things started falling in place there, and that's really when I started to slide down the Mac as Zodiac thread, because things were just piling up. Everybody likes to discount what Mike Mageau said about Zodiac when he saw him, because he didn't get the best look, or it was a profile for the most part. But the one thing he said that was very unique was that Zodiac had a large round face. And sure enough, Mac has a large round face. It's very unique. So, the more I found, the more I dug, I was able to find out his height and weight was 195 pounds, 5'8". That's exactly what Mageau said. Mageau said that Zodiac was 26 to 30. Mac was 24 at the time, but he looks a little bit older than that, so still within the range. Uh, so that's sort of how I started sliding down the point of no return, when one thing started going adding up, and then finding different addresses and things like that, which we can talk about, different connections. Um, it was hard for me to return to, that somebody else was Zodiac at this point. And along the way, I thought I would find something that would definitely rule him out, and just the contrary, I haven't been able to. And then people like yourself keep finding stuff and throwing it up, and it's like, okay, it's just one more coincidence. He probably has the most circumstantial case against him, as somebody like Arthur Lee Allen, but we know Arthur Lee Allen wasn't the Zodiac. So if Arthur Lee Allen wasn't, but he had all that stuff going for him, maybe somebody else with a lot of stuff going for him is. So that's sort of where I got connected. And I'd like you're organized, whereas I'm not. I just like to shoot from the hip. You have a list of stuff that is worth talking about, worth discussing. So I'm gonna let you just sort of be the host here and just dive right in, and we can start talking about some stuff.
Yeah, so kind of following on from what you were saying about like a new approach to like the payphone and so forth. I think that's what was compelling early on, is that even just before I found out about Mac, I'd already started to think about whether people had applied like geo-profiling and so forth, geographic profiling. And I was very like persuaded by the podcast you did with Lee Meller, where you blind tested Mac, your suspect then called Mason, against Lee Meller's profile. So he created a profile, right, that matched very closely with what we biographically knew about Mac so far. And that was kind of stunning to me, that I knew that both geographic profiling and criminal psychology had like a predictive power, like that based on the past behavior of serial killers, and therefore it greatly persuaded me, and that has given me some kind of pointers along the way about where to look in the archive, and what there's also a kind of unusual family tree to Max, particularly on Mac's father's side. that could be kind of indicative of some prior issues within the family that we might come on to talk about later when we're discussing events of 1968 in particular with Mac and the potential stressors within his own family. And I think one of the first things I was able to find was I would been on Reddit and I was discussing Mac as a suspect with various people. And there was a woman on there who kindly let me have access to her Ancestry account. And I was able to see the entirety of Mac's family. She built a very exhaustive family tree on there. And I'd looked at all of the family members, including the extended family, and there's a lot because Mac's father was adopted by his grandmother, and he was brought up as the brother of his father, and it's kind of an unusual situation. And I think there were 10 children in all. So I'd systematically revisited the family tree multiple times, and about 3 months in or so, I visited the branch of the Wolfinger family, who was Mac's father's cousin. And what was interesting is Mac's father grew up in Montana near Polson, in a place called Flathead. And we knew that there was a kind of Montana connection with the Zodiac, that he had mentioned Deer Lodge County, and that's recorded in the police report from the testimony of Brian Hartnell. And when I looked this time, there was a new document attached to Nonna Wolfinger's page, and it was a death certificate. And someone from that someone that was like distantly related to her had gone to the archive and photocopied her death certificate for some reason. And what was striking at the very top on the right, it says Deer Lodge. And I later discovered that Nonna Wolfinger was actually, it gives the dates for her admission to it was a infirmary within a mental asylum in Montana in Deer Lodge County. And she was admitted for bronchial pneumonia and was sick and died during the period from between of the Lake Berryessa attack and the Presidio Heights attack. So she was admitted a few days before the Lake Berryessa attack and died shortly after the Presidio Heights attack, I think. Yeah, I don't have the exact dates on me. And this also overlapped with an escape from Deer Lodge Prison, which is only 20 minutes drive from the Montana State Hospital, where Nonna Wolfinger was an inmate, is recorded as an inmate. And the two prisoners had escaped from Deer Lodge Prison, which is the state prison that was seemingly mentioned to Brian Hartnell by Zodiac. These two prisoners were escaped during the same period and were recaptured in the nearby town of Anaconda, which is the county seat of Deer Lodge. This kind of makes a connection between Mac and his father and this cousin that died exactly at this point. And it seemed an incredible coincidence to me that it was startling.
Yeah, and let me just interrupt real quick. So for the listeners out there that may not know exactly what we're talking about, so Zodiac at Lake Berryessa told Brian Hartnell that he was an escaped prisoner from Deer Lodge, Montana, and that was not known. It hadn't really been reported in California. It's not in any newspapers. It wasn't on the news. So for him to say that, and for there actually to have been an escape situation and escaped prisoners at that moment in Deer Lodge, seemed to be a connection between Zodiac and Deer Lodge that maybe he didn't think of. Maybe all these years later people would be putting two and two together and maybe coming to some conclusions, especially since he planned to kill Brian. So that was a big clue. Since it hadn't been in the papers, how would Zodiac have known about that unless he had some kind of connection back to Deer Lodge in the form of family members? Maybe he had lived there, maybe relatives lived there. So that is how the Deer Lodge thing becomes important, especially with Mac.
Yes, and it's kind of notable that Mac's father, Andy, lived on the next door farm to this cousin when he was growing up. So there's an early census that shows that they were kind of proximate. And there are later articles that show them at kind of family events together. So there is a strong connection, and it seems that Andy did return to Montana during the 60s for school reunions and so forth. So it's even though it's 1,000 miles away, which makes it even more remarkable because it's a very unpopulated area of the country, and it's
Mm.
very distant from California.
So and I see, I don't know what you think, but this is what I think. I theorized, I don't have any proof of this, it's just a theory. I theorize that Mac's parents were maybe talking with each other or talking directly to him, and they mentioned, oh, cousin so and so is not doing so well. She's in Deer Lodge in a institution dying of pneumonia. Oh, and by the way, we had these two escaped prisoners. Did you hear about that? I can see Mac either talking to his parents directly, getting this information, or listening to them talking to their family members back in Montana, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, he drops his clue at Lake Berryessa and brings up Deer Lodge just in passing because it's a good cover story to say I'm an escaped prisoner from Deer Lodge, because he had just heard about that from his parents, and it didn't mean anything. Police had never been able to put that together with anything. It didn't lead anywhere. Those prisoners were obviously apprehended. They weren't Zodiac, but I think it's a slip, and it's a direct tie between Mac and his family to Deer Lodge. And when Zodiac said that, that story wasn't known to people in California just because it wasn't on the California radar. It didn't make the news there. So I think it's a big clue and a big slip up on Zodiac's part.
Yeah, and people can go and check the newspapers to show, and it shows that it certainly wasn't reported in the Bay Area. And what I mean, I kind of see it as what they call a tip of the tongue confession. Is that what's interesting if you read the police report is that Brian asks about the prison escape twice. He kind of presses Zodiac on it, and it speaks well to Brian in some sense that he was trying to get the upper hand in the conversation, and he kind of forces Zodiac to repeat his story, and obviously Zodiac is trying to maneuver them into a position where he can tie them up or they tie each other up. And in order to be convincing, maybe he drew on his recent memory of this conversation with his parents, and to make it more plausible, he draws on a real event. And this is why I also have a further kind of theory around this, is that people often wonder why the Paul Stein murder is so different to the prior pattern, and why it occurs so soon after Lake Berryessa. And what's notable about Lake Berryessa is that Zodiac never writes a letter about Lake Berryessa. He writes on the car door, but he never again references the attack on Brian and Cecilia. And I have a feeling that he became paranoid and upset that he perhaps made this slip up, and
Hmm.
this perhaps provoked him to make a more sensational attack in San Francisco to draw the heat away from himself. Because
That,
the Deer Lodge detail was not printed in the paper at the time, and was only printed a couple of years later when a journalist returned to the Zodiac story, maybe in like 71, 72 or something like that. They printed in the newspaper he might be from Colorado or from Deer Lodge, Montana, which was like there's conflicting accounts from various, but in the signed police report it says Deer Lodge, Montana.
yeah, and for the listeners, just to clarify again, in speaking with the police, Brian couldn't recall the exact name of the town. He thought it might be Fern Lodge or Deer Lodge. There's a Fern Lodge in Colorado, but the key difference is there was no prison escape at the time. There was a prison escape in Montana at the time, so that's the key difference between the two, making it most likely that he was talking about Deer Lodge. But that's a very interesting theory. If Mac realized that he left someone alive and he was Zodiac at Lake Berryessa, and he says, "Oh shit, I gave him a clue. I mentioned Deer Lodge." Maybe he was afraid that that might somehow come back to him, and he didn't want to write a letter taking credit for it.
Yeah, and this is what I think is interesting. If the detail had made it into the papers, perhaps Mac's parents would have read that, and that would have
Mm,
been somewhat of give it a telltale, right?
yeah.
And what is interesting is Mac's dad in the early 60s or mid 60s, he'd written to the Vallejo Times Herald to correct a fact about Anaconda in near Deer Lodge. There was a question about a chimney that's the tallest in America or something like that, and he corrected a fact. So it kind of shows that he knew about the area. So that was another thing that connects the family to that specific location.
Very
So
interesting.
yeah, and there's a kind of question around Mac and why Zodiac perhaps used the phone at the car wash in Napa after the attack. When I read the other day that the Zodiac passed something like 13 phone boxes on the way, and chose to use the one at Napa. And there's an interesting fact that Mac's friend said that he was very involved with a kind of a fraternal civic organization called the Kiwanis, which is a kind of connected to the Freemasons, I believe. And the Kiwanis were having an opening event in 5 minutes from the car wash that started at 7 p.m. that evening. So there's a kind of question, if Mac was highly involved with the Kiwanis in Vallejo, would he have attended this event? So that's another kind of thing that I think perhaps is a possibility, although perhaps hard to prove.
Very interesting though, and maybe if he goes to that event, it sort of gives him an alibi. Hey, I was in Napa because I was at this thing, even though it was, it may have been after the times might not have lined up, but it would still at least give him a reason to be going to Napa. And if anybody ever found out he was there, he would say that's what it was. That's very interesting.
Yeah, because people at the event may just remember his face there. It's kind of interesting in the newspapers as well. It's discussed a number of times that week, and the event started at 6, but I think the band and the dinner only started at 7. So there's this kind of perhaps a plausible alibi being fabricated there.
I've been trying to keep up too with everything that you found, because a lot of this stuff you found since I originally brought Mac forward. But you do have quite a list of interesting things. What else do you have on the list?
When I first started talking to you about Mac, I was kind of still tied up in like the kind of mythology of Zodiac, and you were much more strict about like times and locations and placing Mac where we have like definite evidence about the Zodiac. And you gave me a couple of like hints about things you're interested in, and you said you thought that there was a baseball connection for Zodiac, and that I then obviously there's two like letters or threats that relate to Zodiac from 1970, I believe. One was the Ed Salmina death threat, and the other was the Taggart family had received two Oakland A's baseball tickets as a gift from Zodiac. And obviously these are unconfirmed, and we've never seen the kind of notes in those. We have some information about them. So I started to look at the newspapers to see if I could find anything that connected Mac to either of these people or where they lived, for instance. And the first was like the Ed Salmina death threat, and this occurred during the period that Mac was a tower guard at Vacaville, California medical facility, where he had started in 1971 or 72 as a tower guard. And this was a surprise. This was a surprising thing to his friends that he had become a corrections officer. And what's interesting is that Ed Salmina received a death threat purportedly from the Zodiac, which we've never directly seen, but it warned him not to leave the house on Saturday afternoons, which was the remainder of the season. And you can kind of count this forward from the threat that the actual this kind of semi-professional baseball season that the Novato Knicks played in, this ends exactly when the Zodiac says when he says that Ed Salmina shouldn't leave the house on Saturday afternoons. And what was interesting to me is that I could find like records in the newspaper of the Novato Knicks playing throughout that season, and they actually played a baseball match at Vacaville CMF where Mac worked, and they played against the prisoner team, beating them 12-0. And that's just only a few days before Ed Salmina got a death threat. So there's kind of question, was Mac on duty at that time? And someone else found a clipping, and I'm not exactly sure if it's from the same match or for another match in the season. But Ed Salmina was known to go onto the pitch and remonstrate with the umpire, and apparently he caused a near riot at the prison when he did so. Obviously, like the prisoners were not happy that their team was losing so badly. And that again was like a remarkable find, I thought. It was like perhaps a letter that we're not sure about and we haven't seen, but we reading on Richard's site about it, we know like a fair number of the details and the content of the message, and
Hmm.
the timing seems exactly right to me, and it's
Yeah, the
it
timing
seems
is
very,
interesting.
yeah, and it seems like if this is the case that Max sent this threat, perhaps he was perturbed by this near riot event.
Hmm.
Perhaps it panicked him, and as a kind of form of vindictiveness or revenge, and it seems like a very petty form of revenge in some ways. And perhaps if Mac is Zodiac, and then it perhaps speaks to his personality, that
Hmm.
he then threatens Ed Salmina, who by it seems from the newspapers was a very popular person in and around Novato where he comes from.
Hmm.
Um,
Refresh my memory. Do you know, did the letter come before he was playing Vacaville or right after they had played Vacaville?
Right after, I believe.
Okay.
I think there's a gap of like 2 or 3 days max. I thought it was a week, and it's actually closer than that when I last checked.
Okay. So the
Yeah,
timing is again, the timing and the connections to Vacaville prison all of a sudden, it's just another thing that how many coincidences can there be for Mac? And that makes me think of the Taggarts
yeah,
living they moved to Vacaville after they got these tickets supposedly from Zodiac, and somehow Mac moves 300 feet from them in Vacaville, later on. And again, that could be the biggest coincidence in the world, but again, it's just Mac is full of coincidences, right down to his dad winding up with the same phone number of a friend in Darlene Ferrin's book. And another thing,
yeah,
Mac's wife told us that he, around the time of the Zodiac murders, he had been working in um, Contra Costa County,
that's right.
and what's the name of the town specifically? I forget what the
Walnut Creek.
Walnut Creek, yeah, in the Walnut Creek area. And lo and behold, there's a prison, excuse me, there's a teacher who's somebody tries to poison him, and he gets a threatening letter from somebody saying they're Zodiac, and he's in that area where Mac is supposedly working. And this is real poison. This isn't somebody trying to scare him. This turned out to be poison. It wasn't a prank that somebody was playing on him. Somebody tried to murder this teacher because there was poison in there. And interesting enough, his wife said that Mac worked at a hardware store, and you could get that kind of poison at a hardware store. So just again, another threat from somebody claiming to be Zodiac. Could have been a copycat, we don't know. But it just so happens to be in an area where his own wife said that he was working during the Zodiac crime. So it's just one coincidence after another with Mac.
Yeah, like they abound, and that's what's surprising. I think you mentioned earlier that as we progressed looking at Mac, I think you and I both thought that we'd chance upon something that would discount him as a suspect, and it's gone in the opposite direction. The kind of mystery is deepened
Hmm.
by the coincidences, and I am at the stage where I have no doubt that if these circumstantials were shown to law enforcement at the time, then they likely would look to him as a suspect very heavily.
Oh yeah, and it's hard to go back, doing all this
Yeah,
stuff 50 years later and then go back in time and say, "Hey, look, if they had, they probably wouldn't be able to do what we're able to do with the help
absolutely.
of the internet and go back and sort of reverse engineer this stuff." But I think he definitely would have been looked at. And another interesting thing, um, speaking of proximity and him being close to stuff, you know, Zodiac references the murder of Richard Raditich,
Yeah,
and we happen to find an address for Mac Andrew in San Francisco, a stone's throw from the Raditich shooting. Um, it's just odd how these things just keep coming up, and Mac is somehow either close proximity wise or has some connection. It's when does it end?
Yeah, and this kind of it's made me realize certainly that proximity is half the issue. And along those lines, what's interesting is that we're starting through these like newspaper archives and so forth, is we've found people in Mac's extended social network that are very close to some of these people. And that perhaps gives you some insight into what is going on with Mac if he is Zodiac, which is what I believe. And the fact that you then wonder if he wants to cause some sort of effect in his social circle, perhaps hear the gossip back from his parents about what's going on with Zodiac. Because, for instance, and this is a good example, we talked about how the Taggart family received a gift of baseball tickets, the Oakland A's tickets, while they were living at Rolling Drive in North Vallejo, and they presume they seemingly received a gift and a note from Zodiac. And this is also a kind of strange thing because when you look at the newspaper articles, this is in response, seemingly in response to an event of a child going missing at a little league, and some little league baseball players, which I would say included the Taggart family's son, who was kind of very big into little league. They were enlisted to help find this child who was later found. So the child was missing for 24 hours or something like that, and was later like found not to be missing, but was in Oakland with relatives. But what's interesting is that Zodiac responds to this, and before the article is in the papers, he has sent this gift to the Taggarts. So what was thereafter interesting, I was kind of looking into who lived near the Taggarts. And I knew that you had looked at who had owned properties nearby, but what astonished me was that opposite the Taggarts lived this guy called John D. Hickey, and he was like a D Malay brother of Mac, and he was a master D Malay. If people don't know what the D Malay are, they're like a kind of youth component of the Freemasons. And your father had to be a master mason in order to be a D Malay. So he was very like Mac. He was in the same D Malay cohort as Mac, and he had been the D Malay master the year before Mac. And so they were very similar in their kind of upbringing and their kind of social status. And John Hickey's mother was very close with Mac's mother, and it turns out that John Hickey lives exactly opposite the Taggarts at the time that the Zodiac threat was received.
Yeah.
And what's interesting as well is that John Hickey's mother and Mac's mother both ran rummage sales at Mac's house, and some of them were for Vallejo Little League.
It's just one more interesting thing in a bunch of coincidences. One thing that you found recently,
Yeah,
I had always been looking for some kind of connection from Mac to the Gilbert and Sullivan, the Mikado,
yeah.
and was disappointed that I never found anything. But you found something interesting not long ago, or in that stratosphere. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so like what's been really handy is in the 60s, if you're a member of like any kind of youth group or fraternal organization, the news of that organization would be printed like weekly. So we have many mentions of Mac in and around working with the D Malay, and then we have all the people listed alongside him who is friends and colleagues, I guess. And one of these fellow D Malay was a guy called Bob Kurtz, and Bob not only was a rainbow bow, which was like a position within the D Malay the D Malay had a kind of like a female contingent called the Rainbow Girls. And this becomes important later because David Faraday's sister was a rainbow girl. And this guy,
As was Betty Lou Jensen, wasn't she?
she was actually like a Pythian sister.
Okay, so
But there's some connection there.
gotcha.
Uh, yeah. And so this guy Bob Kurtz, who was from Benicia, but he was part of the Vallejo D Malay, it seems. He played Coco the Executioner, which is one of the lead roles in the Mikado. And Coco the Executioner, people have long talked about in relation to the Zodiac because it's this kind of executioner figure who's kind of got this kind of, he writes the little list that Zodiac later mentions. And this was a play put on at Vallejo High School in 1965, and Mac had seemingly left in 1964 to go to Vallejo College. So this guy's 1 year behind him. And this guy, Bob Kurtz, is mentioned alongside Mac in many of the newspapers and Mac's friends. And he's also mentioned alongside this a girl called Ronna D. Carmichael, who's notable because she's actually in Darlene's address book under a phone number that Mac's father uses from about 1972 onwards. And it's inexplicable to us why Mac's father, Andy, ends up with this phone number and uses it throughout the 70s. So astonishingly, someone on Tom's board had memorized the number from Darlene's phone book, and seeing an advert with Mac's dad's number in said, I recognize that number. And that was just another shocker, I thought.
It's just super fascinating, and it's not, it's not easy to explain. I don't know. I'm trying to think back to, when I was a teenager back in the 80s, and if you switched a phone number, maybe it's still the same case today. If you switched a phone number, you didn't want a phone number anymore. Somebody moving to the area would be assigned a new phone number. It might be the phone number that you just had. But if somehow, some way, Mac's dad got Carmichael's old phone number, that would just be like a huge coincidence, and I had wondered if somehow, and I wasn't able to find any of this out, but I had wondered if somehow that house that they lived in, they were living there, maybe Mac's dad owned it and the phone went with the house. And when
Right.
they moved out, because they did move out, if he started using that phone number once they moved out, took that phone number over. So I was always wondering if it had already been tied to Mac's dad. They were living there, running it, whatever the case was. They move out, and he now gets the phone number back. So, it's just astonishing that now you've got Mac's dad using a phone number of a girl in Darlene Ferrin's address book. You've got this guy that Mac obviously knows and is probably friendly with, or at least, interacts with, that's playing somebody in the Mikado that Zodiac is later referencing. Um,
Yeah.
and you've got this girl, Ronna Carmichael, listed right alongside him. You can really see how small this circle is. And there's one other one, and I'm sure we'll get into it too, is the Donna Lass connection.
Yeah, so this is another proximity kind of discovery, is that I believe someone called Jibber Jabber on Tom Voigt's forum, he was investigating something separate and found a connection to Mac. There was a business next to 623 Tuolumne, which is the home and office of Mac and his family. And the business was called Pesante Music, and it was I believe they sold jukeboxes or something like that, coin-operated machines, and they licensed music. And working at this location was a woman called Donna Lee Lass, who worked as a receptionist or secretary there, and she was married to the cousin of Donna Lass, who went missing and who is associated. She went missing in Lake Tahoe, and her remains were recently found, and it was kind of a discovery last year.
Mhm.
This Donna Lass in Lake Tahoe was the cousin of this Wayne Lass, who was married to Donna Lee Lass, who worked next door to Mac. And so there seems to be some connection there. And this Pesante Music was owned by a guy called Harry Policar, who was he was actually on the board of Blue Rock Springs Golf Club, which I thought was notable. And his son, Raymond Policar, actually carried Betty Lee Jensen's coffin at the funeral. And we know that there was interaction between the two families because I think Harry Policar's son hosted a fundraiser at Mac's home, or some of the, there was extra rooms and storage space there. But he hosted some kind of youth fundraiser in the early 70s there, so showing their families interacted. So again, it's kind of questionable whether Mac is intervening in the Don Lass case to create some kind of gossip or stir amongst his family and friends so that he can kind of bathe in it. That would speak to like that would be a very similar motivation to what we see with the Zodiac and as a kind of attention seeking.
Yeah, and it's I had always wondered long before I ever found Mac, why would I didn't think Zodiac was responsible for kidnapping Donna Lass, but he had to have picked her for some reason to have hinted that he had killed. And I always wondered why her, because she wasn't from Vallejo. If it was a case in Vallejo, then you could see him taking responsibility for it. Whereas Lass was outside of Vallejo, and I forget how far the distance is. I think it's a couple hours. I may be wrong, but it's not really close to Vallejo. So for him to just pick that case randomly for Zodiac to do that, to me, I felt there was some other reason. He didn't just read about her case out of all the missing people, because there's a lot of women murdered in California and missing. Why would he pick her out of all of them to latch onto? And I think now it's because he's right next door to this music place where they're undoubtedly talking about the case. Maybe they've even got flyers up in there, just can we put some flyers up in there? And the owner says, sure. Your cousin's your husband's cousin's missing. Let's try and help find her. So I have no doubt that Mac, living next door, or his parents would have heard about that and been talking about it. And he says, let me pretend that I abducted this Donna Lass. So it gives a connection. Again, it's like the Deer Lodge thing. Zodiac, not anywhere near Deer Lodge, is bringing up Deer Lodge, and Donna Lass is nowhere near Vallejo. Yet Zodiac is claiming responsibility for her. So he had to have chosen her for some reason. If he didn't really abduct her, chosen her case. And I think it's a clear possibility that it's because they're talking about this right next door to his house, and he would know about the case, uh, as I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it perhaps speaks to Zodiac's motivation then, because many people have remarked that he wasn't, he only had he was only average as a killer, right? He left many survivors, and well, he was about 50-50, right? And then there are a lot of women who were abducted in Contra Costa in this period, who some people have suspected Zodiac for, but I tend not to think that it's related to Zodiac. So the question is, why does he intervene in the Donna Lass case? And that maybe will gives us some potential leads for the future. Like, did what if we want to know what the connection is to like Daniel Williams, who Zodiac purportedly like poisoned, is it because there's some kind of oblique connection, family connection to someone who lives nearby or something like that? Is Zodiac's primary motivation that he wants to like kind of smugly hear other people talking about him? And what's notable about Mac's home is it's also this kind of social hub for various organizations his parents and he is involved with. So
Hmm.
it's a good place to find out gossip and information.
And
And it might be a good place to track the how the case is going from if his parents are in contact with. They're very socially engaged. That's what I noticed.
yeah, and one interesting thing too, another coincidence. Well, two of them. Let me say them before I forget about them, because I think they're important. Zodiac in his August '69 letter writes at the bottom of the paper, "No address" in big bold letters with the crosshair symbol. It's like, to me, I knew, again, even before I ever found Mac, that's a hint of some kind. Why is he saying no address? Well, what do we know about Mac? He's bouncing back and forth from his parents to Chico to go to college.
Yeah.
And he's back and forth showing up for weddings in Vallejo, showing up for holidays. And along those lines, lo and behold, he comes home for the weekend on the first, Zodiac murder. Lake Herman Road says he came home that weekend. So here we have Mac showing up in town, and the first Zodiac murder happens. Another outstanding coincidence.
Yeah, and that he returns home several hours after the attack, according to his parents. Which is, I mean, there's some other discrepancies in news article where they announce his return to Vallejo. And it's also kind of notable his parents have at least one other property in Vallejo, this Sandy Beach property that's a shack down by the Napa, by Merritt Island, and it's they're seemingly connected to other properties. So it it wouldn't be unimaginable that Matt could come home early, hide at another property, and then return in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or it's a case of maybe, his parents are older. Maybe they went to bed early because a lot of older people go to bed early. He comes home at midnight after the Lake
yeah,
Herman Road murders, and they're asleep already. And, they wake up the next morning, he's there, and they're like, oh, he came home overnight. So to them, it's Saturday. So the paper's saying he came home on Saturday. Doesn't
yeah,
mean he wasn't on Lake Herman Road at, 11:30 the night before.
yeah. And it's kind of, they actually say they're busy with Christmas parties all week. So, maybe they've been drinking, maybe they're out late, who knows? And it's kind of the other discrepancy there that I mentioned is that he was supposedly enrolled in a master's course in Chico, but we have conflicting reports about that. A friend of his says that he was working an insurance job in Chico that he failed at and had to return to the Bay, and his wife had never heard of him returning to Chico, and he
Mm.
seemingly never completed that degree. So we want to. It's kind of curious that his parents announced that he's studying in Chico at this point, and he had also he had his draft permanently deferred, and he didn't get a student deferment, which to my mind means that he wasn't enrolled in Chico if that was the case.
Yeah,
So
and as
yeah,
as much as stuff as we've been able to find and piece together, unfortunately, it seems like the crucial time, we know he was in South Dakota at college for a portion of 1968. We know he's back and forth between Vallejo and Chico. But then during the heart of the Zodiac crimes is really where Mac drops from sight,
yeah,
and there's nothing verifiable on him anywhere. Besides an occasional wedding mention or something like that, we don't have any hard evidence what he's doing during that time. And that's the time when his friends are all leaving, they're all gone, he's sort of alone. This is the time his wife claims he was working back and forth in Contra Costa. So, that's the void of time where we don't have a lot, and it would be very helpful to have something from this time. Um, and I've even offered rewards to people on Facebook, on Twitter, anybody that knew Matt come forward with audio or a video of him from that time. I would pay them for verifiable information or even more handwriting. And I've never been able to get anyone to do that, which is another strange thing in itself. It's almost like Mac dies and all the audio, video, pictures of him, even any written documents all disappear. I forget what story his wife told us on the forum, but I just found that awfully strange. It's almost like he was, erased or,
yeah.
or hidden. And I'm not implying that they knew something was shady about him. Um, I it's just strange. And even going back to her explanation, I think on her website that she's the one that bought that Zodiac book because he didn't want to for some reason. I don't remember what the detail was, but he wanted her to go out and buy the book, almost like he didn't want a record of him buying a Zodiac book, or a cipher book. So there's all these little things that, one or two things you can write off as coincidence, but for me, there's just too many things, and the more you look, the more things you keep finding.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost notable that Matt goes dark exactly at this point when the first murder occurs. That's the last mention of it in the newspapers till 1972, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's almost the period of his parents write to the newspapers about him and his progress, consistently up until about 1968. And thereafter that we almost know almost nothing. His wife told us she was quite distinct, actually. She said that he lived in Vallejo and worked in Contra Costa.
Hmm.
And originally, I thought it was either or, but again, she was vague and didn't know the entire details. And phoned a friend of his and she was quite upset that the friend told her a different story of
Mm,
him doing this insurance job. And other than appearing at several, there was quite a number of his friends were married that year, nearly all of them.
hmm
And I think there's even 6 weddings or something like that. And
hmm
he's listed in many of them. But other than those mentions, we don't know where he is or what he's doing. Maybe his social security would turn up something, like some kind of employment.
Oh
Um,
yeah, his
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 wife,
wife would have to get that. It has to be
yeah,
like a close relative, somebody directly that could get that. She could get that information
right,
and maybe, lay something out there that would somehow absolve him or write him off as a suspect. But that's up to her. But that would give a complete record of everywhere he ever paid taxes into, every job he ever had, the
yeah.
name of it. We would have a lot more details, but I'm sure she's never going to, you know, be one to help us find more stuff that makes her husband look more like he could be the Zodiac.
Yeah, because we actually found Mac requesting an apartment in Chico in May 1968, and so he seemingly headed to this master's in Chico that his parents have earlier announced, and it seems he went to South Dakota in early '68 to improve his grades, perhaps so he can get on this master's. And then it seemingly doesn't happen because he never acquires that degree. And so there's a series of perhaps failures in his life at this time that we can somewhat speculate about. He he goes to move to Chico, and his parents seemingly think he's studying in Chico, but his draft records show that he was not registered as a student. So is there a deception going on? Has he failed to get onto the masters? Has he not told his parents, or are his parents embarrassed at this failure somehow?
Hmm.
And are they providing some kind of cloak of like impunity, like they to keep up appearances? Maybe you know, he's not mentioned in the papers. We don't know what he's up to. Have the parents like doing something to kind of save face? It's unclear because they certainly don't communicate many of these facts to his future wife, who said,
Sure. And
yeah,
and to be fair to her,
yeah,
she didn't know him until 1974. So anything she knows secondhand what she was told or what Mac told her, or maybe some kind of documents that she found. Like she supplied his South Dakota information for the school that he was at that point. But that's all she has is what she knows from secondhand information because she didn't know Mac during that time. And so I'm not accusing her of covering for him. She just didn't know him, and whatever she knows secondhand.
yeah. And I mean, to be fair to her, that I think she was honest as she could be. She provided certain documentation and handwriting samples. She clearly doesn't think he's anything to do with the Zodiac. But there does seem to be a discrepancy between what she was told and what other people were told.
Hmm
Um, and it's curious to me why it's so mysterious this period. And I wonder if he's moving around. Perhaps he moves to San Francisco near to the Raditich shooting because he gets a new job. She seems to think that he was either working at Ace Hardware, which didn't have many branches in Contra Costa at the time. Martinez was the first one, which is where there's a Zodiac threat, and there were none in San Francisco. But she also says that he worked in an insurance job, but had no idea that he was working up in Chico at that time, which is something a friend told her when she questioned him about it. Um,
And that's the problem when you're trying to piece together
yeah,
something like this. You don't have much to solid to go on. You're going on secondhand information, and you don't know how accurate it is. You can't really, if you had an address or name of the business or something specific, that would give you a good starting point. But it's
yeah,
hard to piece all that together. Then the next time where Mac really has a solid timeline is 1971. That's when he takes that job with the state.
yeah.
And what happens to Zodiac during that time? That's the last time he writes a confirmed letter. So the timeline there is interesting. And then when does Zodiac start writing again? 1974. What happens to Mac? He meets his wife and gets engaged rather quickly. And you get this sporadic few letters in 1974. Then Zodiac doesn't write again, any confirmed letters. And what happens to Mac at that time? He marries his wife at that time. So everything is just perfectly lining up again with Mac timeline wise with these major events in his life and with Zodiac's writing letters or not writing letters. And then when all of a sudden there's a possible Zodiac correspondence from Eureka, California, which is nowhere near Vallejo. That's another situation that's what 2-3 hours away, I think.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, there's a possible Zodiac letter in 1990 from Eureka, and lo and behold, Mac owned property in that area, which is nowhere close to Vallejo. So that's what makes it so strange that Zodiac's possibly turning up in Eureka, and Mac just happens to own property. It's almost like this is from a book that somebody wrote. That the details are just so bizarre. You couldn't think that so many things could line up.
Yeah, I mean, some of these biographical facts kind of dovetail quite nicely with the timeline, and that's what's remarkable is that this keeps getting confirmed the more we find out, is there are more and more things that tally with what we know about the Zodiac communications. Um, Even though some of them in the late 70s are questioned. I mean, what I find interesting about, for example, the SLA letter, which I know some people discount. The SLA was actually formed in Vacaville CMF, and there's some controversy around this group as to whether there was involvement between the CIA and the formation of this group, and whether that required the collusion of people working at Vacaville CMF, because there's questions around the leader DeFreeze, how he escaped, and many thought the group was suspicious about the group and felt that there was some kind of honeypot to mop up radicals in the Bay. So even though Patty Hearst was, sorry, is it Patty Hearst? She was,
Yeah, Patricia Hearst.
kidnapped by the SLA in the early 70s. There's some suspicion that she was actually a member of the group already. And what is odd is the kidnapping of Patty Hearst is the thing that propels the SLA into the national consciousness, because she was the daughter of Randolph Hearst, who was the owner of, like, I believe, all the big newspapers in San Francisco, for example. But they had some prior history in the Bay, their safe house was exposed in Concord, which is not far from Vacaville, a few months before the Hearst kidnapping, and it was believed the group was already formed within the prison at the time Mac was working there. So it would be on his radar, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And then her case was making headlines, and Zodiac didn't want to be outshined by that, so that would have also been another reason
Yeah.
to write and come out of the woodwork and not be forgotten about. We've touched on a number of things as far as coincidence. Well, one more, just they keep popping into my head. I can't even keep track of them all. The Alamo Drive connection. Here's
Right.
Lyndon Lafferty has a suspect who supposedly that he, in his mind, had terrorized a woman that lived on Alamo Drive, and as Alamo Drive or Alamo Road, I can't remember, but
Yeah.
and
Right.
here this is a teacher that's getting these threatening letters and getting these mysterious phone calls. Somebody's harassing her, not to, they're hanging up instead of talking. She's getting letters, threatening letters, and come to find out, Mac is associated with an address that's less than 300 feet from her apartment. Um,
Yeah.
so it's just another astonishing, here's a Zodiac connection, possible Zodiac connection. Um, at least Zodiac in the Zodiac sphere, where Mac just happens to be, within a stone's throw of this woman's house. Um, and then there's little things you can really start reaching for stuff. I mean, these things just jump out at you, but there's other things you can look at and question: is that something like, way back in, I think it was 1969 or 70, there was a possible Zodiac, unconfirmed Zodiac letter from Fairfield, and it mentions that he was going to quote unquote go for the government life,
Yeah.
and which most people take to mean that he was going to get a job working for the government or the state or something like that. And, maybe Mac did apply during that time, during the Zodiac years, and it took him, because sometimes they have hiring freezes or they don't have openings, and all of a sudden, he applies and then they finally get one in 1970 or whatever it is, 1971, and he goes to work for the state. And maybe that was a letter from him if he wrote that letter and he had applied to work for the state, and that was another hint that he threw out possibly in that letter. Um, there's just so many things you can look at and possibly tie to him. And again, we can't prove that, but it's just an interesting thing looking back when you know his career. We don't know, I should point out to listeners, we always mention he's a prison guard. He worked for the state as a prison guard, but he may not have started out as a prison guard. He could have worked at some other capacity for the state and then transferred to the prison system. So I think people always assume that he definitely was a prison guard his entire time working for the state. But, without having any firm paperwork, it's hard to say for sure.
Well, I mean, the only thing we know about his employment prior to that was that he is listed in the 1972 Vallejo directory as a laborer, and that's a kind of catch-all job description. So he could have been working for the state, or it could just mean his job at ACE.
Yeah.
Uh,
And wasn't there something, and maybe you found this, or maybe somebody else did, I can't remember. Wasn't there evidence that he had pestered his family member to get him a job in the prison
yeah,
system?
yeah, and this actually connects to one of the Zodiac communications. So originally, when you were looking into the Taggarts, I noticed that there was a neighbor called Rosalie Ashbow, and she worked for a woman called Jean Kotvitz, who was a realtor, who was also a chairperson of the Solano Property Apartment Owners Association, as was Mac's father at a certain point. And in Mac's father's retirement article, he's Mac and Jean Kotvitz are all photographed together with her husband, who worked at Vacaville CMF. And Mac's wife had said that he'd been given a family in to the job, which just means a family connection. So this woman that lived next to the Taggarts worked for the person that likely got Mac the job. So again, there's a close connection there.
Hmm. It's just another
Yeah.
coincidence. So we've talked about a number of things that make Mac look strong, that he could be the Zodiac. I want to talk about some negatives, some things that
Yeah.
I mostly hear online from the naysayers of Mac. And then maybe I want to ask you too about, are there any things about him that they don't line up with your estimate of who Zodiac was? But the two most common things I hear, and you probably would agree with me, are Mac's ears are too big and his feet are too small. I mean, it's just so Mac has some ears that in certain pictures they don't look noticeable, especially the ones with the longer hair. And then also maybe if he doesn't have the glasses on, maybe the glasses made them stick out further. I don't know. Um, but what we know about Zodiac um, is that he sometimes wore glasses and sometimes didn't. Mike Mageau said Zodiac didn't have any glasses on. And, obviously the kids that saw him in San Francisco said he did have glasses on. Well, we've seen pictures with Mac having glasses on and without. Sometimes his ears are not protruding. But the big difference is, that sketch, that infamous SFPD sketch based
Yeah.
on the kids in San Francisco, they saw him from 50 feet away at night. I don't care how good your eyesight is, and if you have common sense, you know that you're not going to get every detail right about somebody from 50 feet away at night. It's not like they're sitting there in a chair posing for a painting or a picture, and you can get every little detail perfect. Somebody's nose shape, lip shape, ear size, those kinds of things, you're not going to be able to get most of the time detailed, 100% accurate. So to me, I don't even care about his ears, because we have the one sketch, and because his ears look bigger than that sketch, people are like, "Oh, it can't be him. His ears are too big." And the second thing is the shoe size. Now, I don't know what Mac's shoe size is. We had know what his wife told us. But to be fair and not accusing her of anything, she has been off on certain details before. So she's going by memory. So could she have misremembered his shoe size? Um, it's not written in stone that that's what his shoe size was. Um, but she said would she say he was a 7.5, and at one point he went up to an 8.5.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe his feet got wider as he got older, but
yeah,
provocatively, I would say she only has his word for it.
yeah, and or memory. And to be honest with you, I don't know what my wife's shoe size is, and she probably doesn't know what mine is.
Yeah,
So asking her what his shoe size was way back then, I mean, it's and boots. I wear a different size boot than I wear a sneaker. I wear a
absolutely.
bigger boot than I do a sneaker. So all of a sudden, if he was really an 8.5, maybe depending on these boots that he's got, maybe he's moving up to a 10.5. So the shoe size and the foot, the ear size are the two things that always drive me wild, because it's the only thing the naysayers have that they can throw up. Um, and there's nothing solid to confirm, that the sketch was accurate, or what his shoe size was. So, I still leave that open. But the one thing about Mac, and I'll say this, and then I'm going to ask you what you
Yeah,
think, that doesn't line up. Well, there's a couple things that doesn't line up with my guess of who Zodiac was before I ever found Mac. I always thought Zodiac would have mailed letters to newspapers and used his real name before he became Zodiac, and then probably wouldn't want to use his name anymore once he was Zodiac. But I always felt if you went back, you could look and find somebody who was maybe writing a lot of letters to the editor, but not calling themselves Zodiac, but using their name. There's no letters that we can really find with Mac. Um, no letter writing that we can pinpoint. Which is, you pointed out his dad has written letters, his
yeah,
wife wrote a letter,
that's
but
right.
never Mac directly that we know of, not one that he used his name. And so I always thought, um, that would be something in Zodiac's background if he ever was revealed. So that's the only thing that makes me say that doesn't line up with what I thought um, Zodiac would be when it comes to Mac. What anything that gives you pause or makes you think maybe it doesn't line up with Mac as far as what you thought Zodiac would be?
Yeah, I think when I first started looking into Mac, I think like you, I thought there would be some connection to places like Riverside, and we found nothing. Although those are non-canonical. And the other place I'm like super curious about is Albany, New York. We've not found any connection to Mac there.
Hmm.
Um, I think in terms of the appearance, I think he's kind of a good fit for. I think there was someone on your, perhaps Chaucer or someone made a spreadsheet of all the Zodiac descriptions so that you could lay them all alongside each other. And Mac pretty much fitted the most common descriptions.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
I think it's only the sunbathers that mention the ears of their person of interest, and the sunbathers saw a man with small ears.
Hmm.
That's kind
And
of
and and to be fair too,
yeah,
that's been an ongoing debate for years as to whether that was Zodiac or not. I don't think it was. I mean, for one, they said he was very muscular, in good
yeah,
shape. He was taller. He was over 6 feet tall, maybe as much as what, 6'2", I think.
yeah,
Muscular. And then the description from Hartnell is, he's Zodiac is heavy set. His belly's like hanging over his belt. Um,
yeah, and slightly like schlubby in his dress.
yes. And
Yeah,
then if you believe the dentist's son saw Zodiac, who I interviewed, he said that the guy he saw that I think was probably Zodiac was having trouble navigating because he looked like he was out of shape, and he was heavy set, couldn't really walk through the woods very good, and was having a hard time getting through that terrain
yeah,
because he looked out of shape. So to me, I think it's pretty clear that they're likely two different people. Although the sketches of the guy at Lake Berryessa does have a general resemblance to Mac,
yeah,
especially of him without the glasses on. So you could see where Mac does look a little bit like that sketch too. Although I personally believe that wasn't Zodiac, but everybody's sort of one way or the other. They're in one camp or the other, whether it was Zodiac or not.
Yeah, so like we have photos of Mac with both of those haircuts. That's kind of notable. And with regard to the dentist's son, he was saying that the person he saw at a time very close to the attack was having trouble traversing the terrain and seemed like he didn't belong there. And notably, Mac had a big scar on his one of his knees, as noted in his draft report, um, a draft evaluation. And his wife said he never played youth sports. So I don't know if he had a problem with mobility or asthma or something like that. But it sounds like someone having trouble traversing the hillside sounds like someone who's not used to doing so. And it's kind of notable. It's always been notable to me that Zodiac always used cars to make his attacks. He
Hmm.
didn't go on foot except at Presidio Heights when he likely had a car nearby.
Yeah.
And we know that Zodiac didn't run at that location.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that's, we know he walked, and again, we can get into the whole debate whether Falk actually saw Zodiac or not, and if he
Yeah.
did, what actually happened during that interaction. I'm sort of up in the air because I find it hard to believe that he would fail to report that until, you know, after weeks later when an article appears in the paper. That's when he decides he's going to write this scratch about what he saw. So I have a hard time saying, believing that he saw him. I'm still sort of on the fence as to whether he actually saw him at all. But um, we do know that Zodiac was on foot leaving that crime scene, and who knows? Maybe he had, as you mentioned, a car. Maybe he had access to an apartment or something like that, or he was going to go hide out. I do find it interesting. We can debate why he killed Paul Stein, but one thing that I was always interested in is why that address at Washington and Maple.
Yeah.
Why did he send him there? And to me, I always hoped I would find somebody connected to Mac that lived around that intersection. Because, if you wanted to freak somebody out that you weren't, fond of, maybe somebody that your family's not fond of, um, you could scare them by having a Zodiac attack in front of their house. Um,
Yeah.
and I've never found anybody with a known connection at that intersection to Mac, but it would certainly be interesting if there was somebody there that Zodiac wanted to frighten, and what better way to do it than shoot somebody in front of their house?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we've not really found any connection other than Chester Klingle works not far from there, a few blocks below. Um, and I think he worked there during the Zodiac period at the fireman's insurance firm, and Mac may have had an insurance job at some point. And the other thing that is kind of more tenuous is that his dad actually ran a grocery business, maybe about a mile or three-quarters of a mile away, um, in the 40s, and that's the closest I've been able to get.
Yeah,
There's nothing too compelling there, I don't think.
and his dad, and I forget the address, but his dad lived in San Francisco before he ever got married to Mac's mom.
That's right.
But I don't remember, or was it the mom that lived there? I can't remember, but there was some kind of connection to San Francisco, not far from there, but it was way before Mac was even born. So, again, unless there's some hidden connection there, some kind of, reason he would have to be there, maybe like the Napa car wash, maybe something was going on there that Mac would have had an excuse to attend that night or something. It's just one of those things that you have to chalk off as, having to dig more up on. One thing I did want to do is touch on some comments from the forum.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually have something to say about the boots in more detail if
yeah,
people
let's hear that before we jump into the comments.
yeah. Because obviously the boots often comes up on the forum as a way of discrediting Mac as a suspect. His wife says that around that time she thinks he was 7.5 in a shoe. US sizes, slightly different to UK sizes, so I had to get used to that when I was researching. So what I work with a guy called Chris Hall quite often on Discord. We looked very intensively at the shoes, and we're kind of able to challenge Mythbust around what's generically called walker boots, which were really just a Vietnam era chucker boot with it had an anti-static and anti-slip sole. So it's a generic name, not the actual brand name. But you can go and find these boots very easily on eBay. So we started sending messages to sellers and got them to measure the outside sole length. And we found that inside there's only a 3/4 inch difference between a 7.5 and a 10.5, which is what was the 10.5 is what's presumed to be worn at Lake Berryessa. So that's not so far if you wore some thick socks, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's the outside of the boot that is uh, more striking in a way, because they had these Avon made soles, and you can go and find boots on eBay with this sole. They're exactly from this period. So the outsole length, it's even less distance, I believe, on the outsole between those two sizes. And we actually found someone selling a size 7 with an Avon sole, and it was only 3/4 of an inch shorter than the boots found at Lake Berryessa. So she said he was 7.5, and I think an 8 was 11 3/4 inches on the outside. So,
Hmm.
and I believe the sole at Lake Berryessa isn't exactly 12 inches. When you look at it measured, it's slightly shorter than 12 inches. So it may not have been a 10.5.
Hmm.
They're incredibly alike on the outside sole length. And we're only talking a maximum of 3/4 of an inch.
It's interesting, and again, it sounds like a big difference. If Max is 7.5, and you hear these 10.5 wing walker boots, well, you're like, oh, he can't be the guy. It's 3 inches difference. But when you get into somebody trying a boot on and putting their foot in there, maybe that little bit of a bigger size felt
Yeah.
comfortable, more easy to walk in, and all of a sudden, that gap you're mentioning, maybe he is able to wear that size boot.
Yeah, because if you've got wide feet, for example, you may have to.
Yep.
And I have to say, size 7.5, if even if they had half sizes, I don't know, is extremely rare. There's a kind of bell curve of foot sizes, and it's like one of the rarest. Um, so it would be very distinguishing to have small feet.
Yeah.
Perhaps to cover his tracks, so to speak, he wore a bigger boot. We just
Yeah.
don't know. But
Yeah.
it's not as significant as people make out.
Yeah, and it's not the same as, it's not irrefutable evidence in any fashion, that's for sure.
No.
And that reminds me too. Some other people have said, "Oh, well, Max left-handed and Zodiac was right-handed." Well, we don't know that.
Yeah.
There's never been any kind of document that I've ever seen that mentioned what they thought Zodiac's hand he was writing with. Um, and Matt could be ambidextrous either way, it doesn't matter, but there's no conclusive evidence what hand Zodiac wrote with. And you know, people also point out, well, he had his holster on his right side at Lake Berryessa and his knife on his left side. And so therefore, somebody that shoots a gun is going to shoot with their strong dominant hand, which is usually the case. Most people will shoot with their dominant hand. But I go back to, well, what if his intention wasn't to shoot them? What if it was to stab them all along and he
Yeah.
wanted to use that knife? Well, he's got the knife on his dominant hand. So, we found the one picture. Mac doesn't have anything on one side, on his right side, on his left side, excuse me, but his cell phone is on his right side. Um, and he didn't have anything on his other side. His wife said maybe he had what did she say? I think she said he had a pocket knife on that side,
Yes. Yeah. No.
in that photo, but there is no pocket knife in that photo. There's nothing there. But on the other side, you have the cell phone on his right side. So why would a left-hand person have their cell phone on their right-hand side? That tells me that he's either ambidextrous or he's capable of doing a lot of stuff with his right hand. Um, because I would never put my cell phone on my left side because I'm right-handed. Most people are the same. So, that's some interesting stuff too to consider when you're talking about Mac.
Yeah, I mean, we know that he ticked his boxes on his social security application backwards, which it usually indicates left-handed. But I know my grandmother was left-handed naturally, and she's taught by nuns, and they forced her to write with her right hand. So she
Yeah.
could write with both. Like,
That was very common back in
yeah,
that era to force people to do right-handed. So Mac may have been the same thing. He may have been forced at times to write right-handed or was able to do stuff right-handed, but I don't think it unfortunately doesn't solve anything one way or another. We don't have any official confirmation of what ham Zodiac was. So when he
Yeah,
wrote, so
that's the question that drives Druzo mad, that he thinks endlessly about. Like,
yeah,
and
yeah. So let's get to some of these questions and comments from people on the forum here. And here's Mulaney Zodiac. He says, and this is a guy that's not fond of Mac, so he's got a few things here, but I'm going to use his first. So negatives for Mac: his age doesn't align with the best witness in this case. The best witnesses in this case, the San Francisco witnesses.
right.
So that's a loaded statement. That's his opinion. He
Yeah,
says that they're the best witnesses in this case because they were 50 feet away at night. I don't agree with him because Mike Migeot was 2 to 3 feet from him and got a very good look at his face, even if it was a not a direct on look.
yeah,
He felt strong enough he could identify him again if he saw him. And the one distinct thing he said was he had a large round face, which we know Mac has an unusually large round face. So in my opinion, M Mageau is just as good a witness, if not better than them, because he's 2 to 3 feet away, and they're 50 feet away. So it's a loaded negative here, according to Mulaney Zodiac, because he says that the best witnesses in this case are
yeah.
the San Francisco witnesses.
I thought these were good questions. And the age question, we have to remember that the kids that witnessed him at Presidio Heights, that they put his age up by 10 years in the second for the second sketch. So there was clearly some debate amongst the children about how old this guy was, and children aren't always the best judges of the age of adults. I
And
can
not
remember,
not
yeah,
only, I mean, and if you look through some of the yearbooks from that time period, you can laugh all day because the pictures are funny. There's 17-year-old seniors that look like they're 40 years old in some of their pictures. So
yeah.
I could easily see somebody thinking Mac was older than he was.
And I read this thing about eyewitness descriptions on the internet somewhere, and it was saying that we often make age judgments based on people's clothing, and we've found photos of Mac where everyone is wearing the kind of tight-fitting clothes of the 60s. Like, young people wore tight clothes. They're
Hmm.
all got their shirts, belts over their shirts tucked in, and their belts. They've all got flat stomachs because they're all 19. Mac is wearing, like, seemingly wearing army surplus hand-me-downs, and we know that Zodiac wore pleated pants, which are from the 50s, not the 60s. They were out of fashion by the 60s. So is he wearing older clothing? Perhaps doesn't care about his appearance so much, because this is something Brian also picked up on, is that he thought he was kind of low class because of the way he talked, and his appearance seemed a bit slovenly. So
Hmm.
we've got a photo of Mac with all his Koani's buddies, and Mac is seemingly, he's got a belly, and he's wearing clothes that perhaps a generation older.
Yeah, it's interesting, and who knows? Maybe it's because when they saw him, he was out
Right.
doing whatever he's doing, fishing or whatever reason he had to be out there. Besides killing somebody at Lake Berryessa, maybe he was wearing his not his best clothes because he didn't want to get
Right.
them dirty or messed up or whatever it could be. But yeah, that's a very good point. Now he also says here Zodiac was left-handed when it appears Zodiac was right-handed. We already went over that. Um, we don't have a picture of Mac from 1969 compared to the sketch. Well, we have one from 68, which is
Yeah.
pretty darn close. And then what's the next one? 1972?
And he's put on considerable weight in the 72 photo, and I wonder whether that's on purpose.
Yeah, that's the thing. The $1 million question is, what was his hairstyle like in 1969? I'm waiting for somebody to dig up a photo someplace in 1969 during the Zodiac crimes of Mac. That would be great to see and see if he's got, does he have a crew cut? Is it longer? Because Hartnell said that Zodiac's his hair was greasy and sweaty,
Right.
hanging through the eye hole. So, which is interesting because if you look at that picture of Mac, the one where he's not wearing glasses and he's got the longer hair, you can see how his hair hangs down. And I think there's even a picture of him with glasses where it hangs down like that.
Yeah, he's got like a wave, it seems. And
Yes. And
and Mike Mageau says curly or wavy hair. I forget the
yeah.
uh
And
Yeah.
it's you could see if that hair got wet, it would hang down across his
Yeah.
eyes if it got wet and out of place. So that part interests me. And then next time Zodiac shows up, he's got a crew cut. So I wonder if, somehow he got a haircut right after the Lake Barris attack, just because he had left witnesses and somebody else might have seen him. So that was interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
it creates some distance. We don't know if he was like laboring at that time, so he may have lost weight since the first, but it's a short amount of time to lose weight. So I'm not so keen on the idea that he changed his appearance radically, other than having a haircut.
yeah. Well, and I'll give you an example just as a
Yeah,
comparison. So the Golden State Killer, Joseph
yeah,
DeAngelo,
yeah.
when he was attacking people in 1974 into 1975 as the Visalia ransacker, he was very heavy set, noticeably heavy set, slow, um, and they have a sketch of him. He's a big guy and he looks like somebody that's out of shape. When he started attacking as the East Area Rapist in 1976, so year and a half later, he's looks dramatically different. He's athletic, he's thin, he's toned, so much so that they didn't know that whether these two guys were the same, even though there was a lot of common similarities between them. Their physical appearance was so different. So I don't doubt that, Mac or Zodiac, if Mac wasn't Zodiac, but whoever Zodiac was, I don't doubt that they could suddenly change their their appearance one way or the other, putting on weight, taking off weight, changing their hair. And it seems like they would want to do that stuff to, because they're worried about being identified.
Yeah. And we have a photo of Mac with that crew cut, and that's a very, that's the resemblance. I've shown it to people who have no interest in the Zodiac case, and they immediately say, yeah, that's good enough.
What's some of the other things here? Zodiac seems to have gone east from Lake Herman Road, whereas Mac lived west. And I don't have the map pulled up in front of me to know whether he's right. I thought Lake Herman Road was north. Yeah, I guess he's saying that. Well, no. Wait,
You can
Lake
kind of do
Herman-
a loop back through the south of Vallejo if you go to Benicia, maybe. But
Yeah,
there's a variety of the directions you could head back to town. Um,
yeah. And we talked about this too on the one where I had the Zodiac profiler Doug McGregor on. You know, it's typical that these guys start out where they're comfortable close to home, and then they start stretching out from there and going further and further away. And maybe that's what we see with Zodiac, because you've got Lake Herman Road, and you've got what 2.5 miles away is Blue Rock Springs. Then all of a sudden it's Napa. Then it's San Francisco. So, I've always thought Zodiac was Mac or somebody else, that Zodiac lived in Vallejo, close to those first two crime scenes. Um, so, and it's hard to say, um, what would cause him to move out further. But obviously, maybe it's risky. The longer you're at home, close to home, the more chance are somebody's going to recognize you're going to get caught.
yeah, because I mean, he's a kind of blitz style attacker, so he's not hanging around long enough for people to spot him in the first two attacks. But he's running a risk of people identifying his car, perhaps, or something. Seeing him coming in and out.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. And then if they know him, if he's going in and out a lot on these weekends, there's a chance somebody's going to run into him, because we mentioned how many people he knew through, these different clubs he was in and stuff like that. Somebody might recognize him, and that would be a problem. And then his next thing here is, do you really think a 24-year-old could have written so many communications to the press and gotten away with this? Well, we know that Mac read detective magazines and things like that. So he probably had a good understanding that, hey, all I've got to do is wear gloves, not leave fingerprints. And, if I can do all that, I'll be okay with it and I won't get caught. But he didn't know about palm prints. Zodiac didn't. He left a palm print on a letter. Um, he left a bloody print on the cab, if we believe that's Zodiac. So It's not like whoever Zodiac was a master criminal. He made mistakes. He was seen by witnesses and came within a minute or two of being arrested for killing Stein. Um, at He was impulsive too because at Lake Herman Road, suspect James Owen, if you believe his statement, says that he drove by and didn't see anybody in or around one of the cars that we know was Zodiac's. And then seconds down the road, he heard a gunshot. So that means that whoever Zodiac was impulsive and out of control enough that despite a car just passing him by, could have seen him or identified his car. He didn't abort the mission. He said, "I'm still going to kill this young couple here." So to me, it seems like it's definitely possible that this could have been a younger guy, somebody Mac's age, because it wasn't a master criminal. It's not like some older master criminal that knew what he was doing. He made mistakes, and he was just very lucky.
Yeah, he made a series of mistakes that could have ended his serial killer career very earlier. Um, and I think that the style of, I mean, for the pattern established in the first three murders is a kind of Lover's Lane type murderer. And I read there's a guy called Dr. Don Tennyson, and he's an ancestor of one of the suspects in the Texarkana Phantom Killer murders, Moonlight murders. And he drew on this report at the time by a psychologist who said that Lover's Lane killers tended to live at home with their parents. And what's interesting is that they pick these are usually younger offenders, and that they pick couples because they symbolize the tension between the parents at home.
Hmm.
So I'd say that the Zodiac murders favor a younger suspect, and Mac would be quite a good age um, to fit with that.
And along those lines, we listed different I forget if it was you or somebody else, and I responded, listed a bunch of different serial killers who started out in their low to mid 20s.
Yeah.
So Mac was certainly within the age of many serial killers starting out in their 20s, definitely not too young from that standpoint. And his next comments were about Count Marco and his letters. Why would Mac refer to himself as Red Phantom, the same name he used in letters to Count Marco from 1962 to 1969, where he signed off happily married and Chicago? Neither of these seem to be pointed to Mac. So a couple things he's assuming here. Um, he says the same name used. Okay, same name used. Okay, so I thought he was saying it was clearly the same author that sent both of those letters. Um, yeah, so we don't know. Again, we don't know everything about Mac. We don't know why he would have used Count Marco um, or Red Phantom in his letters. I don't know why Zodiac did that, whoever Zodiac was, whether it was Mac or somebody else. We can't know everything about that. It could have been just something he saw in the newspaper, um, something he read in a comic book. Who knows? I mean, so it's kind of hard unless you determine that person is and they're alive. You can ask them. Right now, it's just pure speculation, and I don't know why he would have used that. What about you? What do you think?
I think there's some kind of interesting aspects to the Count Marco layer. It could be that Zodiac is testing the newspapers to see if his handwriting is still detectable when he disguises it, because there's a slight embellishments on the handwriting, but despite that, Sherwood Morrill thought it was the Zodiac. Count Marco visited Vallejo quite a number of times, and there's articles in the Vallejo Times Herald throughout the 60s, and he was often received by like Navy wives clubs or like women associated with the Rotary Club and stuff. And I think they kind of got a thrill out of him being this kind of heel type character. And I wonder whether Zodiac feels some kind of jealousy because of that he's, Count Marco is also a persona that's invented. He's clearly, he's not a real person. And what's odd about the Red Phantom letter is that the one that Zodiac is seemingly replying to was a syndicated letter that had been published numerous times in different places in the United States throughout the 60s. I think there's even one from the 50s. So the Count Marco's column was recycling old letters or perhaps inventing the letters themselves just because it was a way of promoting these appearances that he did. So I wonder if there's some kind of, a bit like Herb Cain, Zodiac is for some reason addressing these kind of famous people because he wants to he's jealous of their kind of notoriety.
Yeah, it could certainly be, and that's the tough thing without knowing if this person was alive and they got caught. You could ask them, "Hey, why did you do X, Y, and Z?" But right now, we're all just guessing. So then he closes with, well, let me see, almost closed here. Um, he says, "My theory of the 40-minute window could certainly fit Mac, but it could also fit someone else. It's not exclusive." Um, to him. Let me just see if to get away right to content the call. Um, it's not exclusive to Mac if it was in such a remote location. Zodiac made calls near police stations, which this phone booth was, meaning he didn't have to live near it. He just had to be familiar with it. Again, it's that it's just a theory of mine that if you've just killed a couple or thought you could kill both of them, and you could have in that 40 minutes you could have been halfway to San Francisco, made a clean escape and gotten away. Why would you risk driving around, hanging around this town on a quiet holiday night where there's no traffic, where you're going to be easy to spot if a police car drives down the street, or somebody happens to see you, you're going to stand out like a sore thumb. So why would he risk making that call there? To me, the most obvious thing that explains the missing time, because you'd have to assume that if Zodiac was from out of town and not somebody right from there, that he hung out in his car and just chilled there in that spot for a good 30 minutes. It doesn't make sense. It's too risky. So, to me, uh, the clear possibility is that he definitely um, stashed his gun, which we talked about earlier, got rid of his clothes, got rid of his car, and the whole idea that he was trying to sell the police so hard on that mystery witness um, is the thing that really makes me scream he was on foot. And some people have said, well, Arthur Lee Allen lived close to that phone booth, not 300 feet away, maybe 3 blocks away. But, you know, I challenge anybody to find more people. If anybody finds more people that are 300 feet from that phone booth, I'll gladly look at them too, the same with the same glasses. I've already looked. I already know there wasn't anybody else close to that phone booth that was living there that is as compelling and then, matches everything else we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the timeline fits pretty well for that theory. Like, really, if you account for taking time to go back home, stash the weapon, take a shower, get rid of gunpowder residue, for example, he might know about those things. And it makes sense not to use the phone at home, but go if you are attention seeking, then
Which
calling
Zodiac was, we all know that.
and what's really interesting about okay, so I'll kind of go on a little bit of a diversion. When the first murders occurred at Lake Herman Road of David Faraday and Betsy Lou Jensen, the story is in the newspapers maybe for about 5 or 6 weeks, and by mid-January, there's barely any mention of the Zodiac. Well, he's not known as Zodiac, but there's barely mention of that murder anymore. There's a few fundraisers later in the year for the couple, but it goes out of the headlines very quickly. So with the second attack, he's obviously planning how to reenact that buzz that he created the first time, but extend it. And I think like using a phone box opposite your house so that you can see the police buzzing all over it would give you a very particular thrill if you were the Zodiac. And it would also disturb all the neighbors, because if you look about all of the people in Mac's dad's retirement notice had businesses all in a line that face that phone booth. There's about 3 or 4 people who own realty firms that face, and all of those people will be talking about it. And I
Oh
think
yeah.
that's why it matters to Mac as Zodiac to use that phone. And possibly he is surprised and didn't know that they could track the number so quickly
Hmm.
or call back. And that was a gap in his knowledge, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And it just again, I go back to the whole overselling of the car. My car was this color. It's almost like he's trying to force that down the police his throat. So they're like, "Oh, we're never gonna catch this guy. All we know is he's got a brown car." It just seems
Yeah.
like he's trying to throw them off too much with that overselling of it. So
Yeah, so the oversell to my mind is because Mike Mageau possibly misidentifies the color of the car and he wants to reinforce that wrong description.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, that would make sense. I mean, it feels like a bit of a childlike lie to me when you read
Mhm.
it. And surely the police didn't believe it when they read it.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
And but maybe the color didn't even matter. Maybe it's the fact he's jamming down their throat that he had a car of any color.
Yeah.
And then so they're like, oh, he could be anywhere by now. And meanwhile, he was never in a car, because, what a perfect way to throw the police off if you could and make them think, okay, we're never going to find this guy. All we know is that, he had a car, but we don't have any witnesses. So he closes out here with, if Mac was Zodiac and was motivated because he couldn't get dates, why would he choose to kill Stein in the middle of an urban area he was not familiar with? So, people have debated this for a long time. It's such a change in the pattern. The first three attacks are all on couples, romantic like situations. They're in lonely spots all by themselves, and it's very unique that he kills Stein in such a way. Um, I'd be, you know, just throwing out a theory if I had explained why he would kill Stein, or why Zodiac, if it wasn't Mac, would kill Stein. You know, I think it could have been for the attention that killing somebody in San Francisco could bring. Or again, I go back to, is there somebody in that area where the Stein was directed to that Zodiac wanted to shock and horrify for some reason? Um, and what better way to do that than kill somebody in, front of their house? So, that would just be pure speculation as to why that would happen. But that's a debate that's been going on forever. Um, is to why Stein broke the pattern of the first three attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, I take what Lee Meller says about the Zodiac quite seriously, that he may be schizotypal, which is like it's a personality style rather than a mental illness. And it's kind of often often presents alongside narcissism. It's not always. And people with this disorder or this personality disorder, they are often very secretive, which is something we know about Mac. And I think that the couples aspect fits quite closely with schizotypal or schizoid personality disorder because there's a general disdain for entering into relationships. And it could be that Mac's friends are all getting married and there's a familial expectation that he ought to as well. And this is a kind of form of acting out against the whole kind of institution of marriage and the possibility that he might have to become intimate with someone. And this might change over time. It's not unknown for people with this style to actually get married, but it causes them a great amount of stress. And this may not be apparent to people around them. So if the first murders were all couples, which is a seemingly a distinct pattern, uh, we discussed earlier how the Lake Berryessa murder and perhaps the potential slipper out about Deer Lodge caused Zodiac to panic. And in I think a very short amount of time, was it I can't remember if it's 10 days between them or 2 weeks. Um, he enacts this second murder of Paul Stein, which seemingly breaks the pattern. And Paul Stein is like a kind of target of convenience in some. There's a special word for it within criminal psychology, where it's he just happens to randomly pick up the Zodiac, and he's seemingly not targeted in any other sense. It's the location that's seemingly important. Is
Mhm.
easy to get away from, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was an anti-police motive. Like he is definitely very close to where there's some patrol cars and there's the mayor's mansion and so forth. And this could be the location could be the symbolic target. Um,
Yeah,
it, we
absolutely.
know that Fook and Anselms responded very quickly to the attack. Um,
Hmm. And the issue is, again, we're, just theorizing Um, and I think his point about like he's attacking young people because he couldn't get dates. Well, that's something that people have said about Zodiac for years. A lot of experts thought that was a driving, motivating factor. I just happened to find Mac, and sure enough, he didn't date. It's not like I forced a square hole into a round peg or vice versa. It's, I didn't say, let me find a guy that can't date and his friends are all getting married. I just happened to find Mac, and then the more we looked into him, the more it was easy to see that he didn't date or get married and didn't have his first relationship until he met his wife. So he just happens to line up with what many people, many experts have thought for years was a motivating factor, that he was targeting people that he coveted that were in situations that maybe he was lonely, wanted companionship and couldn't have it, or maybe to your point, the narcissist point, where he didn't want to be with anybody and sort of resisted it, but it didn't look normal, because all his friends are running off getting married and here he is not.
Yeah, I mean, if he was seriously depressed, for example, he may be angry that other people are happy. And that, like you say, he's coveting what they have, but resents the fact that he hasn't. He may feel entitled to it, in
Mhm.
this proto-incel type manner. And it may be like later when he is married. What I found notable is, and perhaps betrays something, is his wife said that his parents introduced them, like through the lodge, where his wife was very active. So even in that situation, he's kind of not selecting the partner necessarily.
Yeah.
It may be convenient because he's the Zodiac to then get married.
Yeah. And, so we know that a lot of these serial killer guys like to camouflage. They like to fit in with society. They don't want to stand out like the troll monster under the bridge, because then people will know, hey, that's the scary guy right there. That's the killer. You know, guys, I think especially back then, if you were on your own at a certain age, because back then people got married when they were like right out of high school. They were like 18 years old. Um, so if you're in your mid 20s and all your friends are married and you're the quote unquote oddball that's doesn't date, isn't married, you're going to start drawing attention to yourself, and that you might not want, especially if you're the Zodiac. You don't want that attention. You want to fit in, you want to be normal. So maybe he has this opportunity when he's introduced to his future wife. And I don't know enough about like people with that kind of mind, if they're psychotic or they're narcissist, whatever it may be. I don't know if they can ever truly change and say, hey, I've been saved, and believe it and really mean it. But it seems like, at least from the letter, that one letter that we had of him that he wrote with the Bible verse in it, that he wrote to his wife, it seems like he legitimately cared for her a lot. And again, unless it's just a complete lie, so maybe he had changed. I don't know. I don't know enough to, I'm not enough of an expert to know if those people can really change and feel love, or maybe be born again, as he
Yeah.
appears to have been.
I mean,
Um,
I've thought a little bit about this, and I think the kind of being born again is another tick in Mac's favor as perhaps one of the better or best suspects. Is that what's really clear is that if we imagine Mac is Zodiac, he's probably going to remain a manipulative person, but perhaps a passive person. And this surprises some people that serial killers can be passive. Like we know that in his relationship, is it uh who was the Green River guy?
oh, Gary Ridgway.
Yeah, Ridgway was actually the passive partner in that relationship, and he loved his wife. By it's seemingly clear that was a real marriage. But he also did things that the fantasy of some serial killers is to bring their kind of criminal activities and their real life as close as possible. and he is kind of morbid that he would take his wife out to near where the bodies were dumped and have sex with her. And in a way, it was to show that he was in control, even if she was the dominant partner. So sometimes people can be shy, passive, and they're actually a serial killer, and no one, it's kind of, it's not clear. And we can never really know what goes inside someone's relationship, but
Mm.
there is evidence that some serial killers get married and use their partner as a shield. And maybe Mac was having some problems around 1977, 78. His wife writes this strange letter about her husband not getting enough credit for being on the pistol team at the prison. And he also becomes born again in 1978, and she was reluctant by her account. And some people have noted that can often be a manipulative thing to cement loyalty within the relationship through like returning to the church, for example. And it could be that this is just another persona that Mac is developing. He had tried the Zodiac persona, it had failed. And then in the by becoming a corrections officer, he's trying to be a lawman and an upstanding person. And
Mm.
maybe this is just another personality style, another public image that he's trying out.
And
Um,
and somebody talked about this. I think we posted about this the other day. Somebody was going back and forth. The A lot of times prison guard jobs are as a result of somebody that tries to get in regular law enforcement and can't for whatever reason,
yeah,
whether it's physical, whether it's mental, whether it's whatever it is. Um, so, you know, maybe he tried to get into law enforcement where some of his friends worked, couldn't do it, and had to take this prison job. Um, and I think that, sort of strengthens that need to fit in, and we could speculate on why he wouldn't have made it as a police recruit, whether it's due to physical ailments of some sort, or maybe there was something in his mental evaluation. I don't know. Again, it's just me speculating, but it's certainly interesting. And there's been, you know, there's been serial killers that have been had jobs as police officers, have had jobs as corrections officers, have been married. I mean, you can name any number of serial killers. Some people say, well, he had a successful marriage to his wife, and these kind of guys can never get married. Well, that's just not true. There's serial killers left and right that have been married.
yeah, absolutely. And I think when you find that there are serial killers that are like kind of more intelligent and stuff, they actually better at camouflaging, and they know that there's certain traits they can't show others. And I kind of think that there's a kind of fair possibility that he was rejected from the police. I mean, there were friends of his joined the police force or went to Vietnam, and he was unable to meet the requirement for the draft, possibly for personality reasons. It could be for minor physical problems, but he was given like a 1Y he was put in the 1Y category, which is like you're not medically unfit, but often people were deemed like to be the wrong personality to be in the military. Like if you were unmotivated, for example. And we
Hmm.
know in this, like his friend says that he was a mediocre student. That doesn't mean he's not intelligent. That means he perhaps doesn't think it's worth the effort.
Hmm.
Um, his parents seem to be pushing him to go for higher level degrees, and he's unable to complete them for one reason or another. And perhaps institutional life as a corrections officer suited him because it gave him a framework of discipline, and he becomes a different person. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's very interesting to think about. I mean, and he did have a lot of college over the years
yeah,
for what his job entailed. It's just I don't know. And what was he, a sergeant? I think he was by the time he
yeah,
retired. It's not like he was some high up in the prison system and all this college had got him to climb way up some ladders. So I kind of, it's interesting. There's been serial killers like Ted Bundy's one, even Joseph D'Angelo, that would use their college training to either hide what they were doing or to help explain why they didn't have a steady job or why they weren't married and living off on their own and still with their parents because they're going to school. and they use that schooling as just a way to stall and have something covering what they're actually doing. And again, I can't prove that's the case with Mac, but he had a lot of college for a job that really probably didn't require it. And so I
Yeah.
always thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's like his adulthood is being deferred, and maybe it was a difficult this transitional because his friends said that he was a bit immature, and maybe he was finding the transition to adulthood difficult. We know that some serial killers are kind of daydreamers, like Dahmer was a schizoid, and we know that Dennis Rader, he lost his job possibly because he's fantasizing too much. And it was a surprise. So sometimes when people have these like difficult moments in their lives, it's these like you have this theory of like stressors, and
Mm-hmm.
we can note stressful times in Mac's life, particularly around 1968. Um, and I think there's another interesting aspect to him becoming a corrections officer. He gets to guard the prisoners. I mean, it's the last person you would imagine to be a serial killer. And at the same time, it's a kind of position of dominance over them. Like he's the best, if that's the case. And he's
Mm-hmm.
in there with like his cousin talks about Manson being one of the prisoners and meeting Manson and how it's actually in his cousin's obituary, as if this is like we've met someone famous. And I mean, there's Kemper was there, Juan Corona, who's killed a lot of people, and this guy Carl Werner, who was actually someone that Zodiac tried to claim the murders of. And I was thinking as well about this being born again in 1977 is people are only born again because they want to atone for something, and or they were being alcoholic, for example. But what's interesting is that it's something prisoners often do if they're seeking parole, and to convince the parole board they've turned a leaf, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe that is behavior he saw in the prison, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, come to think of it, you just made me think of something else. Stressors. He has this change of life, 1977, 1978. What happens that year? The first possible Zodiac letter in 4 years. Now, I personally don't think that 1978 letter is from Zodiac. Um, but if it turned out that it was from him, it'd just be another thing that lines up with this stressor in Mac's life.
I feel that in Mac's life there is something going on in 77, 78. There's a lot of changes happening at CFF. There's numerous scandals that are coming to fruition. There was corruption at the prison. There were women officers coming into the prison to work for the first time, and people in his union objected. And so there was, and at some point he goes to work somewhere else, doesn't he? So was he going to get moved? Was his wife saying, "I'm not happy with your behavior. You've got to shape up," and then he decides to become born again because he's like, "Will this marriage? We haven't had children. Will this marriage last?" There's a number
Hmm.
of things that could be happening at this point where he's feeling less than comfortable. And the other thing that's notable before we know the exact date he was born again because his wife blogged about it.
Hmm.
So and it's very close to the 10-year anniversary of the first murder. It's on the 24th of December 1978, I believe.
Hmm.
And perhaps he is reflecting on his life. And what is kind of notable to me is that it's also 4 days after John Wayne Gacy, they start pulling bodies out of his house and it's on the TV nationally. So is he thinking this could happen to me?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. And maybe if he legitimately changed or felt he had changed or wanted to change, maybe he's really happy to have found his wife and she changed him for the better. Maybe that was the reason he needed to say, "Hey, let me do a reset here and see if I can start over." And it's fascinating to think about. Um, Now, PC 9900 here said, speaking of stressors, if Mac was the events and stressors of 68 were critical, you talked about that. Um, as were the apparently stabilizing influences of 71, 72, absolutely. And can you go over a more detailed timeline of these years, which I think we did pretty well. So I think we got there. And also he talked about, are there ways to get access to additional college, medical, employment, social security records that can be pursued? Yes. Um, for the most part, if I haven't gotten them already, the only other person that can probably get them is Mac's wife. Um, and I want to say, I've said it before, but I want to say again, I don't think Mac's wife knew he was the Zodiac killer and covered it up. Again,
No,
she didn't know him back then. The Zodiac crimes were pretty much done, and he had written his last letter almost by the time they met. But you know, I don't think she would hurry to hand stuff over that's going to make him look more guilty. On the flip side, I think if she had something where she could come back and slap it down and say, "Hey, this proves he wasn't the Zodiac," I think we would have seen that from her. Um,
absolutely.
and I don't think she's in a hurry to give us anything else that's going to make Mac look more guilty. But she could get a number of different things that could help give us more information about Mac, especially the Social Security records. There's going to be a list of every job he ever paid taxes into and what their name was, where they were located, that kind of thing. She could get all that and put that out there, but I don't think she'll. And I've said it. I posted it on the forum the other day. She's welcome to come on this podcast and talk with me anytime. I don't think she's going to take me up on that, but she's welcome to. And I would definitely have a conversation with her, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely understandable, and perhaps there's already guilt because they had these online blogs and so forth from which we gleaned a lot of information that were public, but perhaps she never anticipated any of this.
Yeah.
Equally, I think that she was in the dark. I personally think Mac is Zodiac. But I think there is more stuff out there. I'm continually surprised when I think we've exhausted it, we find new stuff. I'm surprised how much we know about Mac because there are some people who are kind of peripheral to case I look up and you can find maybe them in one directory and their date of birth.
Hmm.
Uh, and there's very little more information about most people. There's a lot about Mac, and maybe some employment records will come to light, or someone knew him. There is a slight problem with people his age are kind of reaching the end of their lives now. So
Hmm.
often we would go to reach out to people that we've discovered who knew him at the time, and they've unfortunately passed away, particularly since 2020 when there was a pandemic and a lot of these people were older. Um, but I'm still hopeful that we'll find some additional information. The timeline, there's a guy. I mean, I should thank everyone that has helped me because not all of these discoveries my own. I
Hmm.
kind of, I'll just give them a shout out. Essa Berry, Michael, Chris Cross, who's very good on the timeline, has mostly blocked most of it in for us, so we kind of know where Mac is when during this, like during the kind of noted events of his life, but not the Zodiac period. And there was a guy called Gorilla Train who actually like wrote to newspapers.com to get them to put the Vallejo papers online. And they did that actually within a few months. And that was really helpful because most of this comes from that. And Mr. Sean's and other people on the Mac thread have been super helpful.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good people on there that are, um, you know, helping to see if they can dig anything up. And again, if we find something one day that could positively rule Mac out, that would be great. I'm not, I could be wrong. I believe 100% that Mac is Zodiac, but until somebody brings something forward, that proves me wrong, then I'm happy to have a conversation or debate with them about Mac. And I'm happy also to see that the trolling has stopped a
Yeah.
lot. There's no trolling, there's no arguing, even if they don't believe Mac is Zodiac. There's some civility, which I greatly appreciate. Um, so so I wanted to get to a couple more comments before we close out here. Let me see here. Here's one scary Gary. Um, I want to say I think Mac is a strong suspect and has things that line up for me, but there is a negative for me. It doesn't appear he had an interest in writing journalism or newspapers, which we talked about that earlier. So I was surprised too that there's nothing that we know of. Do we have newspaper clippings? Mac himself wrote in to give his opinion on a matter. We don't know of anything. Um, did he have the personality of someone that had to always prove he was the smartest and opinion mattered more than everyone else? I think that gets to the narcissist point because
Yeah.
sometimes those secret narcissists they'll give you like a uh, I don't even know how to describe it. you know it when you're around them. They give you like a, they're not always vocal,
Yeah.
but they'll give you little jabs here and there about how they were right and you were wrong, or how they were wronged in a situation or something like that. It's not always blatantly open. And not knowing Mac, obviously, not interacting with him, I can't say if he was like that. I don't know. And again, he had friends. It wasn't like he was antisocial and he was the loner that never had a friend. We know he did. Some of those friends admitted that they thought it was a little bit odd, but they still liked him, and they weren't, obviously they didn't think he was a killer, someone that would be a serial killer. They weren't freaked out enough to not hang out with him or live with him in their college home. So nobody said I think he was a serial killer. It's not like I found somebody that said, "Oh, I can't believe he's the Zodiac." It doesn't shock me. There was none of that. So if again, it's not always blatant. It's not always out there in your face that you're so strange and scary that you set off all these alarms for people. It's not always like that.
Yeah, I mean, we have had reports about Mac's personality back from people. His wife and his friend both said that he had secrets or secretive, which might lend it to this kind of personality style, like this kind of covert narcissist. But we do have there's a couple of instances where there is writing to the papers. For example, when his wife writes to the papers on behalf of the pistol team that he's on, she neglects to mention him by name, but gives her name. But the tone of the letter is incredibly aggrieved that they haven't received recognition for this like achievement. And there's a lie here, there's a kind of lie here, and it's not his wife who's lying. There was a big article about the pistol team a couple of years before. So she says they've never received any recognition, and that's actually not true. And
Hmm.
if someone was like, say, a covert narcissist, they may manipulate someone or create a mood that someone else in their life attempts to resolve for them, and perhaps picks up on. And there's another writing instance that I think connected to Mac anecdotally from his wife is that when they were I can't remember if this was in Oregon or somewhere else. They were going for brunch, and as she relates the story, they went to park and someone was parked badly, and she went to go to the restaurant, and when she met Mac by the door, he told her that he would like to get thousands of cards printed up, or hundreds of like little note cards that he could stick on the cars of bad drivers, telling them off. And
Hmm.
I thought that was kind of I think you went to Lee Meller to discuss that. It's
Hmm.
it seems Zodiac like this anonymous, like addressing people anonymously in this kind of aggrieved yet kind of righteous manner. It seems an odd way of communicating because it's indirect. And if we
Hmm.
know anything about Zodiac is that he communicated very indirectly.
Yeah, and that's a great example too. I had forgotten about that. It is, you know, I think people are always looking for somebody that has a sign on their house with flashing lights saying "I am the Zodiac." That scares their neighbors, and everybody's afraid to go by the house. And the guy was always so strange, and he was never married, and everybody's looking for some strange, scary guy that sets off these giant signals that he's the serial killer. And most serial killers are not like that. They are
Oh,
trying to fit in the best they can, even if they may know that they're not like everybody else. They're trying to make themselves look like everybody else. So, I think that's right in that same vein.
yeah, and it's also why I think that suspects with a criminal history have less chance of being Zodiac because someone who's conspicuous has a criminal record. They would have been investigated by now. And I think it's going to be Mac fits well because it's someone who's inconspicuous and in the background. For instance, there was a guy I used to work with on the forum called Will, and he contacted everyone from Mac's yearbook who was still in Mac's year, who was still alive, and he only got a handful of replies. And the people that did reply said, "I remember his name, but I can't place him. Like people knew who he was, but they couldn't tell you anything about him
I
except for
got the I got the same responses.
yeah.
It's funny, and I don't want to throw you off track, but it's funny to think about all these people all these years later getting contacted about Mac and then saying, why are multiple people contacting me about this guy asking me if I remember him?
Well, what was funny in that instance, he got one substantial reply from a guy that got caught shooting out the windows of a flour mill with Mac. It was Mac's idea, and they went to shoot at this mill, and they got caught by the police. And thereafter, their friendship kind of drifted apart. But this guy was he didn't think Mac could be Zodiac, and it was funny because Will didn't mention that he was investigating Zodiac. He just wanted to ask about Mac.
Oh
And
wow. I
and
didn't
this
know that.
guy, this guy goes, "It's funny. I've kind of guessed that you're inquiring about Zodiac because I too, coming from Vallejo, am highly interested in the
Oh
case."
jeez. Wow.
So at the same time, he didn't think Mac was Zodiac. He thought he was like totally twigged what he was being asked about. Um,
Interesting. That's funny. And again, I go back to some of these people that are getting contacted with about Mac all these years later. They got to be wondering why are these people reaching out to me asking about this guy out of the blue? And to that point, I think someplace out there, somebody may have something important that would help us more with the Mac mystery, whether it's photos of him, audio or video of him would be the holy grail because you could hear his his talking mostly, maybe see his walking, his mannerisms. Somebody like Brian Hartnell. I mean, Brian Hartnell is really the only person now left on the face of the earth that could really shine some good light on like Mac's body language and hearing his voice. He would know better than anybody if Mac could be Zodiac. And if he passes away, he's got to be what 75 or something. I'm
yeah,
guessing
yeah,
70, 75. Um, if he passes away, there's literally nobody left on the face of the earth that we know for certain has heard Zodiac's voice. So I mean, how hard would it be to solve the case at that point?
yeah. I mean, hopefully, there's going to be some other way of solving it. It could be that he remains the one of the best suspects forever if there's no forensic resolution. I mean, there's two ear witnesses. Nancy Slaver has obviously passed away.
hmm
It was notable to me that Mac's wife became very irritated when we asked her what his voice was like.
Yeah,
She told
it
me
was
told us to pound sand, like,
yeah,
which
just
is fair enough.
and again, I go back to I just find it strange that all the existing audio, video, photos, all that stuff of Mac have somehow miraculously disappeared. If my wife, if somebody, now again, if she was mad and somebody accused me of being serial killer, my wife might tell them to screw off. You're not getting shit. I mean, but to say, I think she would say that. I don't think she'd say, well, all that stuff has disappeared and been erased and deleted and thrown away and burned. Um, so it was a little bit of a different response. If Kim just told us to screw off and pound sand right from the beginning,
Yeah,
but to be giving of some information, but then say all these photos, videos, and audios and stuff, they don't exist anymore.
yeah.
Um, I just find that strange. Again, I'm not accusing or relying. I find it strange. If it's true, I find it strange. If it's not true, why would somebody not be telling the truth about it? So either way, I find it very strange.
I mean, it's altogether strange that, according to her, his dad went on a tear, as she describes it, which I believe means getting excessively angry or drunk, and destroyed all the family memorabilia, including uh, all these photos of quilts that his mum had made and childhood, things to do with childhood that Mac owned.
Yeah.
And that seems to suggest that there's a problem within the family. Perhaps he was prone to anger, the father. That be expressed through Mac. That kind of could be one of the motivating factors if that's the case, because sounds unusual to me. And on the question of the voice, I was looking in the newspapers the other day, and Kathleen Johns actually made a report about the voice of the person that abducted her, and saying that they had a soft monotone,
Hmm.
which is I didn't know that that had been reported at all. Like,
Hmm.
so maybe there is a connection there.
And it's again the whole the dad going ballistic and getting rid of everything in some kind of angry thing is one thing, but you mean to tell me that after how many years were they married? 1974 to 2004?
Yeah,
Um, 74, what is that, 30 years? My math is
I
terrible.
think. Yeah, did he die in
That's
2014?
2014, so it's
Yeah,
40 years. Yeah,
yeah,
so you mean to tell me 40 years together, she doesn't have any audio tapes or videotapes of them? I find that strange, especially because
yeah.
back in the 80s and then probably into the 90s, everybody had a camcorder and was recording
VHS,
stuff.
right? Yeah.
And you just mean to tell me there's none of that stuff around? I don't know. It's strange for me hearing that, and it doesn't make sense one way or the other. If it's true or whether it's not true, it doesn't. It's strange.
I mean, I could see him being videoed for things like instructional stuff at work. If
Oh
he was
yeah,
a
absolutely. Well,
weapons instructor, like, yeah,
that's the thing. Is there some kind of piece of videotape out there of him talking anywhere? Instructional video is a good thing. Um, Be interviewed for something. The fishing video, I'd hope that that fishing
yeah.
video he had a part in that maybe he was talking on it someplace or
Well, he was the cameraman, and so he wasn't in front of the camera, and
yes.
he was also into photography, and I wonder if that is something to do with if you're always behind the camera, you never often photographer. I've noticed this with photographers; they don't like being photographed sometimes.
Hmm. And that's
So,
is there something more sinister to that, or is that just
yeah.
a personal quirk or something? But so before we wrap up, is there anything major that we missed, and then going forward, what kind of stuff are you going to be looking to find still?
Well, there is still stuff to discover in terms of the like his social circles. I mean, more recently we found that he has this tenuous connection to the Ferrin family. He was actually in a Cub Scout group with the Ferrin brothers, and the den mother and father of that group were Paul Ferrin's parents. So he would have known them. And that's what I'm always between, are the victims entirely symbolic, or is there some kind of connection somehow?
Mhm.
Um, so I think we're gonna keep at like looking at newspaper stuff. Chris Hall, who I work with, he's quite good at like reaching out to people. We don't often have success when we email people, but when we find someone new that Mac is closely associated with, we at least try and send them an email and explain why. I mean, it's always a kind of questionable whether people think we're cranks, just contact them out of the blue.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe we'll just hit on someone. Um, I think there's more stuff to discover, and there may even be more revelations about Zodiac in the future because there's certainly held back information that may. We've had a few things lately, like the kind of the DNA of the Riverside hoaxer and stuff like that. So there's new things can be revealed all the time, and that might set us off on a new line of investigation.
Well, I've and just to update you, I've had some nothing earth-shattering. I've had some contact with SFPD, um, with
Yeah,
Mac. Nothing. Again, they didn't provide any new information. Um, just said, you know, send what you got and that kind of thing. Um, and no comments about checking prints for Mac or anything. Now, back then, back in 1971, when he started working for the state, things weren't computerized, they weren't digitized. If he gave prints, for example, to do a background check, those things are in a folder someplace, in a locker someplace, most likely, unless they've somehow been digitized, but as I highly doubt that.
right.
But there could be a personnel file someplace with Mac's full resume, application, prints, things like that out there that can be discovered. Because if they've never been digitized, like, how would they ever compare Mac's prints to the Stein prints? Um, so I'm thinking something like that, a real golden piece of evidence could be out there someplace that could exclude Mac if it doesn't match the cab print, for example.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's also the possibility that, sometimes in medical procedures, especially people that have had cancer and stuff, they've had um, different
The
procedures done.
biops biopsies, right?
Yeah, there can be biopsies of
Yeah.
things that are stored that are frozen that aren't disposed of, and one day that could, be used for DNA, or eventually. And I'm sort of getting nervous about this because I don't think it'd be taking this long. But if there's a chance of doing genealogy using DNA left behind on the letters or the ropes or any of that stuff, I think they would have done that by now.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
mean, they
making me nervous that it's taking this long.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a forensic problem. They have to find an inventive or creative way to attack, and it could be expensive. That's the other problem is cost.
Yeah.
And I think that they have recently solved some older murders. And I've seen some as late as 50 years ago.
Hmm.
Uh, so there's always hope, and they still have some stuff in like considerable stuff in evidence, including the cab, apparently.
Yeah.
Um,
I,
so
I go back to the whole thing that San Francisco, especially San Francisco, well, California in general, so overrun with crime, fresh crimes, are understaffed, they're under budget. I mean, they're over budget. I think they have such a hard time with the current caseload of crimes that they're not worried about something from 50 plus years ago that the person's likely dead. They're not gonna,
yeah.
so I don't think solving the Zodiac case, although we all want it to be solved, I don't think that's first on their list when they can solve things that are fresher. So, my hope is that one day somebody does it just to maybe just to brag and say, hey, we're the police department that solved this infamous
Yeah.
Zodiac case. I'm hoping that somebody takes the reins and decides that they're going to try and do it once and for all. But, right now, they have the technology to do to extract DNA profiles sometimes even from a rootless hair. So if Zodiac
Yeah.
left a hair in an envelope or left a hair on one of those bindings that he handled, anything like that, even something along those lines, it might one day lead to genealogy solving the case.
Yeah, I mean, I even saw a 10,000 year old piece of wood, which they have non-destructive processes now. And I don't know if they use like microwaves or something like that. They investigated the DNA structure that was embedded, soaked into the wood. So they have ways of like people were always worried would they destroy the evidence by testing it, and I think they're kind of past that now. Um, but there may be like held back stuff, and someone just has to have the wherewithal to do it. I mean, in other cases that are older, it's often the families of the victims that push for further testing.
Yeah,
That might be difficult in this case because of as people get older and stuff, there's less and less people that kind of to kind of represent the victims anymore.
that's true. Well, and hopefully, again, if DNA one day solves this case and they hold a press conference and they say we've solved this case and this is the person that was Zodiac, I will 100% accept the outcome. Although I'm confident they'll say Mac's name at the press conference. But again, whoever's name they say, I will 100% accept it. I think there's some people that have written books and been very vocal and gone on TV claiming to know who Zodiac is. They're going to have some bruised egos that might push back and say, maybe something like, oh, there was a two-man team or they messed it up and it really wasn't this person. I think there's people that will still think their suspect was Zodiac, even if they turn out not to be.
Of course, and I think there's specific things about this case that make it very different to other cases. It's taken on the character of a kind of mystery, like the Bigfoot or something like that, and people tend to treat it like that. There's some people get upset that it could be solved, I think. And what's been interesting looking into Mac more than any other suspect, it's demystified aspects of the case for me. I'm not that invested in the kind of mythology of Zodiac, whereas I used to like look into all the symbolism and so forth. I'm still interested in those aspects of the case, but they're very much secondary to the how, why, and where kind of aspects that Mac brings up.
Mm. There's plenty of that to look into, so I don't think you're going to have end in sight of stuff you can keep digging into. And I appreciate you all the help you've given, because again, what I found was just the tip of the iceberg. Since I came forward with Mac's name, it's just been all kinds of things, and I hope it keeps trending in that direction so we can find more about him. And thanks for digging, and continue to do what you do, and I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me on, and thanks again to everyone that's helped me. I've got another guy called Krasdor he's actually doesn't favor Mac, but he's been sending me tons of things that I was never able to find. So I'd like to thank everyone that's helped me as well, and you for interviewing me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.